We have two great speakers today, giving an overview of the opportunities and challenges of exporting to Russia and giving tips for getting started doing it, is David Cant from Albion Overseas. Albion Overseas have been helping hundreds of UK businesses to sell into Russia since the 1990s, so David has loads of experience and expertise to share. And after that, we'll have Alec Bessey from Oxfordcrown, who will be sharing some of his experiences and tips. Oxfordcrown is an educational consultancy Alec set up in Russia, so it would be great to hear some on-the-ground experience there. But to begin with, over to you, David.
Firstly, thank you for joining the webinar. Thank you for your time. I'm going to focus on companies which are selling, and particularly companies which want to sell through distributors or agents. There are various ways of doing that. Albion's been around for 20 years plus. Russia is quite literally all we do, and we are distributors in our own right. In addition, obviously, excuse me, we do various other things which you can see on that slide. So yeah, next slide, please. So an overview of Russia. I'm not going to read the bullets, but I'm going to just try to talk behind the bullets, as it were. What I've found over the years is that companies do some very odd things when it comes to Russia, and I'm not quite sure why that should be. But of course, it's probably something to do with the fact that everyone has a view on Russia. In fact, we had somebody in here earlier this morning just repairing our printer, and he absolutely knew everything about Russia, but of course it was all from the television, and most of what he was saying wasn't really entirely accurate. A very common approach to Russia is to find somebody who speaks Russian, have them conduct some initial work. What we're going to try to do is not necessarily to solve problems, but just to raise some issues for a little bit of further thought. There are some issues which are insoluble, and part of that is because Russia is unique. Russia is the biggest country in the world. It's also in a state of flux. Then again, Russia is the biggest country in the world, and it's in a state of flux. In other words, what one business person considers to be a problem, another will absolutely consider to be an opportunity. I don't know if you're aware of the joke when the shoe salesman goes to the subcontinent to sell shoes, and he comes back glumly saying, well, clearly this isn't a market for us because nobody even wears shoes. So they send the next guy, and he comes back and he says, he's full of the joys of spring. He says, wow, what a great market. Nobody even wears shoes. So what we're going to try to do in the next few minutes is to look at some of the key areas to consider when choosing partners. We also believe that Russia does need an individual approach and deserves time. Next slide, please. You may be surprised at this slide, but according to the World Bank, Russia is easier to do business in than India, China, or Brazil. Not only easier, but you can see from looking at the top bar that Russia's put a lot of work into its corporate governance, its checks and balances. It's actually very difficult to improve on these listings. As you know, if you look at somewhere like India or Brazil, or China for that matter, you can see that they're moving not at all or very slowly, whereas Russia is really surging ahead. So that's one that certainly takes most people by surprise. Next slide, please. I personally think there are 5 ways to do Russia. I've thought about this long and hard over the years, and so let's have a look at the next slide, see what is number 1. Okay, this seems the obvious one, but it's not necessarily obvious, but at least it doesn't cost anything. There are some companies out there which might be in the privileged position of being one of very few worldwide suppliers, but most of us aren't in that position, so sitting and waiting for business is not really ideal. So let's assume that's not what we're here to discuss today. Let's look at the next slide. Okay, if you're insane, you open your own Moscow office, which is what we've done. Now that's all good, but you really need to be committed to Russia to open a Moscow office, and I'm going to assume that most people don't need to have a Russian office. 99.9% don't. For the few companies like Albion, whose 100% businesses in Russia, it makes a lot of sense. But of course, Russia does operate rather differently by comparison to Western models. So it's not for the faint-hearted. Next slide, please. Now here's where we get into the very British approach to exporting, and certainly to exporting to Russia. You can have a DIY approach to exporting to Russia, setting up sales proactively, independently, visiting the market. And companies that do this, and there are many, demonstrate that they're hungry for business, that they're willing to go out there and bring that business home, but it must be done very actively. It can be expensive. It can be even more expensive than doing things through a third party, ironically, because it sounds like it should be cheaper. But after all, you've got not only the travel costs, but presumably costs of interpreting, and most importantly, the cost of your time. So let's look at the next few slides. The next few slides are what most companies do, and there's a little visual on that, which is that if you measured the landmass of Russia, it's actually the same as the landmass of Pluto, and you could fit 70 of the UKs into Russia. And that is why I think Russia needs a different approach. So finding a distributor or an agent is the most typical way that companies approach the Russian market. Quite often companies just appoint a distributor and then they go home and wait, which I don't think really is a plan. It's more like a hope. A lot of companies that come to us are dismayed at their distributor's performance for whatever reason, but more importantly, they've got no idea if what their Russian distributor is saying, for example, about customs costs or certification costs and so on, whether it's true or not true. So I would always say, use a distributor by all means, but you, the exporter, need to understand export documentation. You need to be prepared for whatever Russia throws at you, bureaucracy and so on, because you need to be able to say, is it true, or is your distributor trying to control this market on your behalf? I just want to have a quick look at some of the problems associated with distributors in Russia, and I'm focusing on this quite deliberately because it's absolutely the most common way that companies get into Russia. Firstly, Russia's moving very, very fast indeed. So fast that on a recent trip to Moscow, I came up out of the Moscow underground and I didn't recognize what I was looking at because so much construction had taken place in the previous 8 months. So you need to choose a distributor wisely so that you're not losing control, time or money. The market is also actually quite young, so companies have been coming and going with alarming speed in Russia. Given that is the situation, it can be quite difficult to find reliable, tested distributors. This market effectively is only 20 years old, so you need to be able to find companies that have a track record, but equally you need to acknowledge that you're not going to find companies that have been around for 35 years. Unfortunately now, the Russian distributor isn't queuing up to represent your product. That was the case 20 or 30 years ago when as it were, the pioneers were there. But it's no longer enough for a Russian company, to have the prestige, as it were, attached to representing a Western company. So you need to find the distributor, which you can do, and you need to present your case. Distributors don't usually share information. So using a distributor, you won't usually know where a product is sold, and you certainly won't know how much it's sold for. So you need to keep that in mind as well, that the distributor will tend to want control. And to be honest, who can blame them? After all, they've put in all the time and the money and the infrastructure, so they want to retain that sense of control. The Russians have a word посредник, which basically means middleman, and so they're always as nervous of being gone around, if I may say that, as they are of going around others. Excuse me. Sometimes, just concluding this slide, a distributor might want to sign an exclusive agreement with you for the wrong reasons, and that is something please be mindful of. Namely, you need to find out what companies these distributors are already representing, because there have been instances where they've signed up distribution agreements actually to keep you out. So a little bit of due diligence goes a long way. The biggest issue, I think, with distributors is the issue of exclusivity, right? And that really is what this slide is all about, because on the one hand, as a distributor myself, I'm always looking for exclusivity. Yeah, because if you're going to nominate numerous distributors, we're all going to be fighting like cats in a bag, and that's not good for anybody. But on the other hand, if you give exclusivity to a distributor whom you're not yet sure of, understandably, then you could be costing a lot of time and money. What if they don't perform? So unfortunately, the issue of exclusivity or non-exclusivity really hasn't been dealt with or answered in a satisfactory way even today. You have to make your own decisions, and the way people usually get around that issue is they appoint a distributor for exclusive basis for, say, the Moscow region or the St. Petersburg city or Moscow city for a period of 6 months. It kind of works, but obviously there are incursions from other nominated potential distributors. So next slide, please. Distributors are a fickle bunch. Just that previous slide, yeah, thank you. So if something else turns up that's going to make more money, they can go down that road. The nature of that risk totally depends on the supplier's relationship with the distributor or the agent. Business relationships, like any relationships, can break down for various reasons, and if that happens, potentially, if you put your eggs in that particular basket, your business could disappear with it. So you just need to be mindful. Distributors are a great way to build your business, but you need to be really a little bit more careful than, unfortunately, we've seen with some companies. It does happen. Relationships break down because it's a very dynamic market. If, for example, you put certification in your distributor's name, if they've said, don't worry, we'll sort that out for you, then that relationship breakdown becomes very, very serious. So for whatever reason, if that business relationship breaks down, and if the business tends to go with that relationship, then obviously you're going to lose time and money, but you may also have given away information which can end up in the public domain. So I would just urge companies to take these decisions very, very carefully. 90% of distributors are excellent. It's the 10% that I'm really focusing on at the moment. Yeah, next slide, please. One other thing to bear in mind is, if I'm right that, you know, in the 21st century, 2017, exporters into Russia starting for the first time aren't necessarily pioneers, because there's so much more infrastructure now than there used to be, then Russian distributors, conversely, are far more picky about whom they're working with than they were previously. So you've got to be better than their existing suppliers. You've got to give them a reason to switch horses mid-race, because for them, swapping suppliers or taking on new suppliers represents a risk. It's an expenditure of time or money or both. So just being better or having global certification or being a well-known brand or anything, that might not be enough. You've got to be able to demonstrate that you're better, you're cheaper, that you've got the possibility to provide service, technical support, replace parts, all that needs to be in place for the distributor to be really wowed by your offer. And because of this, you need more than ever to support a distributor. So, for example, we come across a lot of companies that say, well, we don't get involved in, say, translating, or the distributor is responsible for footing the bill for a trade fair. And that may well be the case, but I would say the distributor that performs best for you is the one whom you support. And I've given a few examples of ways in which you might support a distributor. So to make things easier for your Russian partner, you do need to put in a little bit of work. So spending time and resource with them just to ensure that your business has the best chance of success. At the end of the day, there's only 4 ways to increase sales. Only 4. You either sell more deals, you sell deals more quickly, you sell bigger deals, or you sell smarter, which might mean higher margins or peripherals or whatever. And although companies think that a distributor or an agent is the least costly option, I sometimes wonder if that's the case. I want to spend a moment looking at an alternative, which is the 5th option, but I won't spend very long upon it because it's not for everybody. But I do think it's something that needs to be borne in mind. what I would always urge companies to do is to consider that by going with a distributor, you are giving away potentially a large margin, and you may not want to. Next slide, please. Okay, very swiftly, a few do's and don'ts. I'll start with the don'ts because they're quite easy. Look on Russia as a separate market. Always look on Russia as a separate market. It's different for a number of reasons, and it's not just because it's the biggest country in the world, but also it's because it's moving so quickly. And actually, the Russians love the British brand. They absolutely love it. So don't think that it's a market where you're going to be struggling. So long as you've done your homework, it's going to be a very rewarding experience, as indeed it has been for Albion for more than 20 years. Next slide, please. We strongly advocate using the DIT, meeting your international trade advisor. Obviously, there are ITAs who have experience of Russia, there are other ITAs who have experience of other markets, so they can signpost you. But you should take advice, although I would always say take advice wisely. Just because somebody says you shouldn't be doing business in Mexico doesn't necessarily mean that person's correct. It may just be that doesn't happen to be their area of expertise. Well, the same is true of Russia or indeed anywhere else. I've said here, get the board on board, simply because you don't want the FD breathing down your neck after one or even two visits and saying, so where's the order? You know, Russia in particular depends upon relationships, and so it will take a little bit of time, and that's not a bad thing. The concept of EMEA is one where, if that's the case, that relationships need to be built and developed, EMEA incorporates, I think, 129 markets. So the poor sales guy who's got EMEA on his business card means potentially flying around the world constantly, and yet not actually drilling deep into any of those markets. Obviously nobody's dealing with 129 markets simultaneously, but the principle is there. I would say choose your markets, be it Russia or other markets, and then really drill deep and get to know your partner, your buyers, and so on. Yeah, next slide, please. Don't necessarily take your Exworks price list and put it into a freight forwarder and then see what your Russian price list is going to be, because margins in Russia are higher. Not just higher, but they're considerably higher. The amount that you may be able to mark up is significantly higher, and there are reasons for that. One is that there's far less competition. The other is that Russians have an expression whereby they say, I'm not rich enough to buy cheap products, and that's quite a savvy thing to say. So I would say, rather than taking your Exworks price list, why not start at the other end and try to find out what is your competition doing, because then you can deconstruct those prices in exactly the same way, be it removing the distributor's margin, taking out the taxes and the customs duties and the transport and so on and so forth, and that way you can build a Russia-specific price list, which you will probably be very grateful for in the long term, because that is where the long-term money is to be made. Next slide, please. I've come across a lot of companies which don't necessarily want to put things into the local language, but it is worth it. We were walking around a trade fair a few weeks ago, and this particular company didn't have anything in Russian, and by chance they bumped into the two most appropriate people whom they could have been speaking to, one from Moscow, one from St. Petersburg, but these guys didn't want to take their brochures because they simply weren't in the right language. So it's a courtesy. You don't necessarily have to put everything into Russian, and certainly not before you know whether you've got a viable business, but at least make sure that you've got some kind of an A4 leaflet, A5 leaflet, something in Russian just to demonstrate that you're committed. I'm saying here, visit your distributor or your agent 4 times a year, and I think that is probably a minimum, actually, which is why, going back to the previous comment about EMEA, I think it's better just to take a smaller select number of markets and make them your own, so to speak. And finally on that slide is the concept of the power line. Russia is a very, very hierarchical country, so you'll find that the higher up the decision-making tree you go, unsurprisingly the faster you make progress, but you can thrash around in the undergrowth for a long time talking to people who actually are not decision makers. So make sure that you engage at Director General or Chief Engineer is always a good one for those selling equipment, because the Chief Engineer will always have the General Director's ear. But mainly get out of the protocol department and get up the tree. Okay, next slide, please. A word on certification. You will need certification. International certification won't wash with Russia. The good news is, although in March of 2015, the previous system, which everybody knows as GOST, came to a close with all but very, very few exceptions, it has been replaced by something which is far more user-friendly. So this is called the Eurasian Union. So Eurasian conformity, or EAC, is the system where a number of countries have signed up to a joint standard. And if I could take the next slide, please. These are the countries that are in it so far. So the good news is, if you just take Russia, Kazakhstan, those are two very, very significant markets. Excuse me. And so now they've brought in, obviously Belarus was one of the founding members as well, Armenia, Kyrgyzstan, and there's talk of Vietnam and Turkey joining the Eurasian Union quite soon. So the idea that they have is to create a bloc which is as powerful or more powerful than the EU, USA, or China. So it's one to watch out for. But the good news for you, if we could take the next slide, is that the documents which you procure for certification will allow you to sell into all of these markets. Russia alone is 145 million people, just a 3.5-hour flight away, so that's not a bad start. But in addition, you have these other markets also. Certification doesn't have to be a barrier to trade. It's relatively easy to get. It's relatively low cost compared to the old GOST system, where there was a near monopoly on who could get you certification. We find that when we're getting certification for clients, they're usually surprised at how quick it is. In some cases, you need one of these documents. On the left is a certificate of conformity. On the right, a declaration of conformity. Sometimes you need a letter of exemption, which is basically a document saying you don't need a document. But in all cases, you will probably be pleasantly surprised, and it's certainly an area where we can help. So next slide, please. I'm just coming to a close now. There is this alternative, which I just want to touch on very briefly. We've tried to create means whereby we can operate with the DIT in synergy. So DIT are very good at the initial market exploration. We can then join in with things like product certification. We can give you Russian partners, basically your own Moscow office. And the idea behind this is that if you have somebody based in the right time zone selling your product, properly trained up of course, you can create traction a lot faster. Next slide, please. How that works is it is usually extrapolated over, say, a 12-month period, could be less, could be more, and it's guided by your objectives. So a company might say, here's where we want to get, here are our competitors, we want to know what they're doing, we want to get their pricing, we want to see if we can match or beat their pricing, and it's a relatively straightforward, and it's been a very popular concept. So next slide, please. Final word on that is what we're trying to do here really is simply to create some opportunity for companies, and to say that with the right approach and with a flexible attitude, you can achieve things very quickly in Russia. Russians don't hang about when they make decisions. They want to make decisions very quickly. But equally, you can make a lot more money and you can get a lot deeper into the market if you just consider some of these things which will allow you to really understand whom you're dealing with. We can also look at a lot of opportunities in the Russian regions. You know, Russia's not just about Moscow, or indeed Moscow and St. Petersburg. So that option is available for those who might be interested in it. Right, next slide, please. A lot of people think that Russia's just for large companies. My experience is rather different, in fact, more or less quite the opposite. And the reason for that is because it's the SMEs who tend to be hungry for business. They tend to want to go out and bring that business home, and they make decisions very quickly. So I'd say SMEs, so long as you've got a budget and you've got a certain realistic approach to the market, SMEs can get very good business in Russia, very good business. Bear in mind, the Russians do like UK branded products. They like UK equipment. They regard British suppliers as reliable. Your word is your bond. High quality. So they are not against you. They will want to talk to you. And the final thing I would say is please, 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 if one thing comes out of my few minutes, it is treat Russia as Russia, because it's not even Central Europe, it's not even the former Soviet Union. It is a market which is sufficiently large and sufficiently on your doorstep to require a more specific approach. I think I'm going to wrap up there. Thank you.
Hey, good morning. Oxfordcrown is an educational consultancy specializing in the placement of students in British educational establishments, and we place students of English, of course, but also people in business who need English in Russia for their business with business partners in Britain. How we do this is by buying places on academic and English language courses in schools and of English as a foreign language, in independent boarding schools, and in tertiary level institutions, colleges and universities. The English language teaching industry in Britain is very big. It's worth perhaps between 1.2 billion and 2 billion. It's difficult to say, but it is a very large industry. The places that we buy are sold to prospective students in Russia through our associated company and agency, Oxfordcrown Moscow, which is in Moscow. In fact, this is our sales and marketing office. The Oxfordcrown Limited has been a member of the Russo-British Chamber of Commerce since we incorporated in 1996, and we work in close collaboration with the British Embassy in Moscow and with the British Council. We are also an English UK partner agency, and these the Embassy, the British Council and English UK support us fully. Earlier, well, actually last year, in 2016, we also franchised a company in China to use our brand in the People's Republic, Hong Kong and Macau. I'll explain why a bit later. We can also we sell courses also in Taiwan through our representative in Taiwan. Could you slide on? Yes, thanks. My contract, I was with the British Council in Moscow doing in-service teacher training, and this contract ended in 1996, by which time I had the opportunity of seeing that there's a growing market for UK-based English language courses, because foreign travel was becoming more accessible at the time. While I was with the British Council, I travelled all over Russia, giving educational seminars, made many contacts, which are important, personal contacts, and had very memorable occasions during this time to know people and to see what they needed. At this time in the early 90s, when I was with the council, many Russian language teachers were looking for additional areas in employment. There was the financial crisis, things were changing rapidly in the early 90s, and teachers and many other professionals needed to find extra employment. And one of the lecturers, tutors at the Kitaygorodskaya school in the Moscow State University attracted my attention for her innovative and dynamic approach. As I said, teachers and other professionals were looking for additional areas of employment. I mean, professors were driving taxis. Many teachers emigrated to Israel at that time, and government institutions, institutes of science institutes and so on, were going over to private research and development projects. And there was a need to expand out of the old system and into a new. And to make contact with that, I felt that there was a need for a local trustworthy partner. And so we discussed the possibility of some form of collaboration, which led to our setting up of Oxfordcrown Limited. The could you pass on to the next slide, please, David? The challenges doing business in Russia. So the biggest challenge has probably been the excessively conservative attitude in Russia towards business initiatives. Now, I perhaps ought to qualify that a little bit and say it's cautious or careful rather than conservative. They like to see first how things work before getting involved. It's not necessarily a conservative attitude on the part of the government bureaucracy, but often a nervousness on the part of Russian clients to try, in our case, new academic courses or method of payment for these courses. There's considerable mistrust of practices which clash with practices with which they are familiar. Again, mistrust is, they're very careful before, as I say, before they leap. For over 70 years, the Soviet Union was a stable society, and new capitalism was a leap into the unknown. Very much like my leaving the British Council and starting up the company was a leap into the unknown. And you do tend to be careful and cautious, but I wouldn't exaggerate the level of caution. But this attitude, the cautious attitude, has been aggravated by the political stance of the last few years, strengthened by the sanctions imposed by the West. From the Russian side, particularly under the present government, there's a nationalist, populist attitude, and so officially they are still very careful. The teachers and other people who have come to Britain, who know us, are much more willing to work with us. The Russian economy faltered, and the oil and gas resources, which are basically the main resources of Russia, of course, the prices dropped, and Russian income in Russia was reduced. But it leveled out last year in 2016, and is now growing with the ruble being stronger, and oil and gas prices, of course, have risen. So I may hope that in the very near future, things will change. With the new American president, it's uncertain which way they'll go, but there is a possibility that that the political stance of the Putin regime might soften. Next slide. Why doing business in Russia is great? It's they like doing business with the UK. English is a world language. It's a way of exchanging expertise and doing business. And the reputation of British education is very high, and the British culture is very much admired. We have everything going for us in that respect. They're honest people to do business with, but there's a slight caveat there. In joint enterprises, they are sensitive about being perceived as a junior partner, as if they were inferior in some ways. But they are, if they are accepted as equal partners, they are honest and good people to do business with. As this problem perhaps arises from the time when, in the 90s, Russia was in some way was humiliated or felt humiliated because the ruble crashed, and they became, instead of being a world power as they had been before, in some way slightly inferior to the West. They're cautious but innovative when they need to be. They're innovative, certainly. I remember the story about the pencil in the spacecraft, and the government technical institutions have transformed into very often private institutions. And okay, next slide. What's next for us? We've, in the face of a weakened market, we've taken to running our own summer school in Bulgaria. That's an English language summer school. With the market improving, we still hope to continue with that, but we expect to be able to start sending considerable numbers to England as well. This summer school in Bulgaria is slightly cheaper for our clientele, and it's run, in fact, by the Moscow City Educational Committee, the whole complex, but we've rented a part of it. The embassy in Russia has helped us recently through the DIT, organizing missions to Moscow, Kazan, and St. Petersburg, which my business partner has attended in the hope of attracting business leaders to learn English in Britain for, or even in situ for business, especially in the oil and gas industry. A number of language schools in Britain offer excellent courses in English for professionals, and we hope to get bookings as a result of these trade missions that the DIT have organized to the oil and gas producing regions. Next slide, David. Tips for exporters. Look at Eastern Europe in general. We've been able to move into Bulgaria to get new customers. Work with organizations like the DIT and the embassies. As I said, we've been on trade missions to Moscow, Kazan, St. Petersburg, and more. And get back to this point that the Russians are sensitive to any suggestion that they are junior partners. They do not like being patronized. In the past, the Russian problem solutions were often crude but effective. and their knowledge has never been inferior to that of the West. Even today, in the West, we depend on Russian rockets to get into space, and the Russian priorities are a little different from ours. When we look at them, and sometimes feel perhaps sorry for them, for the Russians, because they're living under a strong regime, but their priorities are different from ours. What they want is prosperity and equality with the West, and democratic rights perhaps come as a second. They're not so interested in that as long as they have the security and so on of being a world power. And last but not least, certainly not least, listen to the advice that Russian partners may give you. That, I think, is probably the best piece of advice.
So, David, just a couple for you quickly. One from Simon, which is just asking about what other markets in which there's great opportunities for UK business at the moment. What sectors and markets are particularly interesting for doing business in Russia?
Well, in about 3/4 of an hour's time, I'm going off to the airport to Moscow, and where I'm going to be staying is right opposite the Dynamo Stadium. And it's quite impressive to watch it being refurbished because, of course, 2018 World Cup represents big opportunities, not just in construction, but also, if you think about it, in things like education, training, language provision, FMCG, infrastructure, communication, all sorts of things. Now, a lot of those deals will already have been done, particularly construction, but there's a lot of opportunity still because they're entirely refurbishing, I think it's 13 cities. Just for the World Cup. So that's one option. Generally, infrastructural projects like automotive and communication, telecoms, oil and gas particularly, all of those represent really, really rich seams to be explored. Consumer goods are massive in Russia, so more or less consumer goods of all types. And we've worked with companies even in food and drink who are very successfully, one company now whom we took into Russia. Russia is absolutely their biggest market, and a lot of companies say they just wish they'd started earlier.
Thank you. And another question, a couple of questions actually from Ian and Jill. They've asked about kind of insurance, and I guess the question is, what advice would you give in getting paid by Russian customers? Would you take things like export credit insurance?
Yeah, good question. Well, obviously you have the sovereign-backed big projects for which you can use UK export finance. For smaller deals, you do have private insurance available, quite expensive. Oddly enough, the Russians have an interesting attitude towards payment, and they will very often pay you 100% up front. You might need to provide a bank guarantee for that, and particularly at the beginning of the relationship. But if anybody understands the structural problems, it's the Russians themselves. So usually we advise asking for money in advance at the beginning of these relationships, and then of course as the relationship develops, you can adopt different techniques, offering credit and so on, which will presumably be a matter of time. But at the beginning, you may find that actually payment isn't your biggest issue.
Thank you. And one last question for David before I ask a couple of education questions for Alec. The question is, what's the cost of EAC certification, and how long does the certification last for?
Depends on the document, but you can usually get certification for 1, 3, or 5 years. We tend not to recommend getting it for 5 years because, hey, it's just moving very, very quickly. The cost can be as little as a few £100 if it's, for example, a letter of exemption. But if you're looking at a certificate of conformity or a declaration of conformity where you need a Russia-based importer record, then you're you're looking at a few thousand usually. We're doing a lot of certification at the moment, and for example, if you're dealing with, say, oil and gas or things where there's life critical applications, then there are more certifications to go through, such as blast and explosion proof certificates. But by and large, you'll find that it's a very pleasant surprise compared to the bad old days of the GOST monopolies.
Thank you, David. And just now a couple of questions for Alec. So we've got quite a few kind of English language companies in the audience today. So one from Mandy is kind of how good is the teaching of the English language in Russian schools, and kind of what is the kind of age demographic for that kind of market?
Well, the future is great. As David said, the Russians have a very positive attitude towards Britain and British culture. The need for English in business, of course, is growing by the day. I'm not sure actually about the question. If this is what you were aiming at.
So I guess it's also a question about kind of, in your experience, is it schools, or is it early age, or is it more professional in terms of the appetite for English learning?
It's for us especially, it's been mainly schools, and from quite an early age indeed. In Russia, English is, where teachers are available, English has been taught from a very early age, maybe 5 or 6. And even today, quite a lot of our customers are young people. We might get a group, for example. The age group, the age range will be from maybe 7 to 14. So for young people, especially, the parents are very keen on their young children learning English. Naturally, for professionals, it comes to the realization that they need English comes at a much later time. Okay.
Thank you. And one last question, because we're running short on time, and this is from Andrew. I guess also to you, Alec. Kind of in your experience, kind of Russia is perceived as having high levels of corruption. I mean, how does your experience correlate to that? Is that something you've ever seen, or is that just a kind of a media kind of message?
Now, in our business, we haven't actually encountered that. We're more like, as David was describing earlier, a distributor. The schools being the supplier, the schools in Britain, the language teaching organisation in Britain being the suppliers, and we are sort of the distributors, and we work through our Moscow office, the sales and marketing office, and we've never had any experience of corruption. I'm not saying corruption doesn't exist, and when I was living in Moscow, on 1 or 2 occasions, perhaps I did have a little experience of it. But in doing business with in education, I've certainly not had any experience of it. Although there was a case recently in Britain, I think the admissions officer, or I'm not absolutely certain of his position at Stowe School had to resign because he took a bribe from a Russian parent to ask the children, to enable the children, or the child, or whatever it was, to get into the school. But I think Russians will often ask, perhaps, if they give a gift to a school, would their child get in? Our answer is always no. But this doesn't preclude the fact that maybe after the child has been admitted, after some time, the Russian parents, whether it's Russian or Saudi or whatever, might want to give a gift to the school. But that's not. We've not had any direct experience of that. Okay.
Thank you, Alec. And I think on that note, because we're due to be finishing at 1, I'm just going to close off now. So thank you to both Alec and David. Really useful information. Great to hear some of Alec's experiences and to get that real kind of thorough overview and kind of some of that more technical information from David as well. I'd like to remind you that we will be posting questions onto the forum in the aftermath to the webinar, so please do keep your eyes peeled for these, and also let us know if you'd like us not to ask you a question as part of that process. So yeah, with a few questions coming in now, we'll hopefully get to them online afterwards. We're running another series of competitions this winter for UK SMEs looking for cash towards their export plans. We're going to be running a few different finals for the competition this time, meaning there'll be more opportunities for you to win some great prizes. So make sure you get your action plan submitted to us before February 10th, next Friday. And as always, if you have any questions or need any support with the tool, then please do get in touch. And finally, the second part of the Beyond the EU series will take place on Monday as we look at Latin America as a potential market for UK exporters, with a particular focus on Brazil. That will be followed by another session on Tuesday 14th on North America, where we have speakers on Canada, the USA and Mexico, which will definitely be very interesting. So please do sign up to those. That's all from us for now. Please do take our survey to let us know how you thought about Rent and to give any suggestions for improvements and future topics. Again, sorry for the slight tech glitch earlier, but as it's a live webinar, these things do sometimes happen, and hopefully we got all the information across that is useful. We hope you can make it to the next one, but for now, have a great day. Thank you.
Thank you.